Hello, everyone. Welcome again to Afghanistan by Afghans, listening to this podcast, TV show, wherever you watch it. I'm sure you've been enjoying these conversations, and now we're like plus 25 episodes. You've met, yeah, probably almost 30 people by now. I'll have to count which episode we're in right now. But today I'm very, very excited to have Chelze John with me. Her name, Chelze, although it's written in Persian, you would see there is not Persian, and maybe we'll get to know where it's from. And she is an amazing character I've come across online, and she has a PsyD. She told me it's not a PhD; it's different from a PhD. Still a doctorate, but
Mhm.
doctorate. It's a psychology doctorate of psychology, and she practices as a psychologist and marriage and family therapist. So it looks like I also need to see her afterwards on professional reasons. But for now, we're going to start. We're going to stick to our interview here. So, welcome, Chelze John. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thanks for the intro.
Of course, I hope I did an okay job. I always try to make it fun and relevant.
Yes, and just to be clear, sorry, my name is with the E at the end, Chelsea. So
Chelsea, there we go.
yes, yes, yes.
It still reads that, so in Persian.
Okay,
We're good. We're
okay,
safe.
okay,
Otherwise, we'll
cool.
have to redo the whole thing. No, no, it still
Yeah,
reads.
the Z with my name you were mentioning is it's actually my mom. She's the one that wanted to match my last name because my last name has a Z. So she just made it up.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, she's kind of creative like that.
Wow. So your name is basically given by your mom, made up from ground zero. Wow.
And they had decided between 2 names, but this one stuck, and my dad, I don't know if there was any influence with, like, because Chelsea is usually with a SEA, and it was a football team in London, I believe, or in, England, and so I don't know if there was any association there, but they just liked it. My mom loved that it matched, so
It does. It does. And your last name is so like grandiose. So Zamani means you know the meaning. Like
Mhm,
I think timeless or time,
mhm,
or it means
yeah,
time. It comes from the word time, period,
mhm.
era. Pretty big last name here. Um,
Yeah.
so we're gonna have a good time. And let's start with your parents' journey. We kind of always start with honoring the journey of our forefathers and how they came to the lands we currently are in now. So tell me, how did your parents, in this case your father, kind of ended up from Afghanistan, and where in Afghanistan were they from?
Yeah, so um my mom and my dad come from 2 separate worlds. My dad, his parents, so I have my grandmother and my grandfather have passed already, but they came from Nuristan and Baraksha, but they primarily lived in Kabul, and that's where my dad, like, mostly, I think for most of his life, that's where he grew up. And then once the war started, my grandfather started to travel to the States, and then he also traveled to Europe to see where they would move. And he almost lost his life like a bunch of different times. But so they had to actually come here separately. So my grandfather came at some point, but really my grandma was the one to bring them both or bring the kids.
Mhm.
Um, and so once they got here, they didn't come straight here. They first started and like a lot of this too is still things that I'm learning because you can imagine, as mental health is a big thing when you go through so much trauma. So that's getting some of these stories with the people who are still alive is pretty challenging. But they made a few stops before, and even before coming to California, they were in Boston and then they were in Texas and they finally made it to they were experiencing a lot of racism in Texas, so they moved to California and that's how he landed here. So yeah.
Nice. I love whenever we talk about a war, like, oh, my parents left when the war started. There were been so many wars that we have to define now which war are we talking about, which era. I'm assuming you're talking about the 80s. or
Yes. Yep.
70s? Okay, all right.
Hmm.
This is, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I know, and it's funny. We laugh about it, but really, it's not even that funny. It's
Yeah,
not
there's
something to
been
laugh about.
so
But yeah,
many, yeah, over 40 something years of nonstop war. And yeah, like the effects of it on mental health, of course. I would love to hear, because I mean, as a country, has been like 40, 45 years of nonstop war. What does that do to humans, to a person? I don't know. I don't personally, but I hope there are studies done or something. But maybe you could share, having your parents or having access to your dad intimately, what does that do to kind of the mental health of these individuals, of us?
yeah, yeah. That's a really good question, and I think I'm still. I think it's one thing that's like interesting is I'm still seeing like really what that means, having met more Afghans, especially Afghan women, more recently in my life. And my family being mixed, you know, saying Afghan, being half Afghan, that was actually like a bad word. Um, and my dad was the middle child, so he had one older sister and then a younger brother, or he has. And so, now that I'm older and really like trying to empathize with some of these things that we experience as an adult, I'm really starting to understand that we do a lot of things to survive and to feel like we belong, right? And I think one of the ways that at least just speaking like to my father, I think one of the ways that he did his best to survive, but also thrive in his own eyes, was to leave parts of his culture a little bit behind, or at least like separate from where he was headed. And so doing that, I think there was a lot of decisions made that just, once you start, it's hard to stop, right? And so I love my dad. I definitely like our family has had like a really hard time with just like I think adjusting to everything, especially after my dad lost his parents. That was really big. But I think in terms of like trying to make sure that he can feel like he made it and he was successful and he did something with his life, he made a lot of sacrifices.
Mhm.
So he worked a lot. I didn't get to see him as often growing up, especially once we moved to Orange County. And so there's just a lot that came with that. As you can imagine, right? When you have to leave things behind, it's like, whoa, that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, yeah, wow, that's beautiful. That's uh, beautiful how you're kind of talking about the whole disidentification process, because I wonder if it's similar to like code switching, or is more of like a permanent code switch, where you have to permanently leave a certain identity behind, all aspects of it. I wonder, I mean, I don't want to go too deep down in your dad's identity. Maybe we interview him on that. But like, uh, uh, yeah, like what affects, when we begin to disassociate with our identity, with one piece, let's say with name, first of all, starts with that, perhaps.
Hmm.
Where does, how does this disassociation, how does that affect mental health? Like, is there like two different like categories in our head that processes this, or what does that happen from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like the way that it showed up in my family was because my dad chose to marry my mom. Um, there was actually a time where my dad was shunned from his parents because of that. And it wasn't until I was born where my grandfather like finally was able to accept the situation that this is life. Like I'm marrying this woman and we're having a kid and um, this is who I am, right? And throughout that time, because he didn't marry someone who was not only not of the culture but not of the religion, there were aspects of that relationship that I think he kind of mixed up. Like, when you're in a multicultural relationship, there are so many layers to how we emote, how we communicate, how we relate. And if you don't understand those things, if you don't understand your identity or your cultural identity and how that shows up to be able to communicate to your partner who's so different than you, then it's more of like, okay, I'll just go with what my partner says, or I'll be stubborn and I'll stick with it, right? So he didn't have like that space to be able to like understand these things for himself. He's super, super sensitive, um, which I love about him because I feel like most people grow up with like their mom being the one who maybe they see more emotional and like the stereotypical thing, right? But I actually saw like the reverse. My mom definitely can be, but I saw my dad really be in touch with some of his emotions, and it was like, wow, like that's just so beautiful. So,
Mhm.
but I think over time, the more that he was kind of pushed into these settings, especially like with work, um, it was actually beneficial for him to forget these things because if not, it would just come with so much pain.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And kind of following that and moving on to you now, a product of a mixed race marriage, mixed cultures. How was it growing up for you, and how, like the Afghan identity, when was that kind of brought into the picture, at what age, or it wasn't, and you had to discover what's kind of been your own personal journey to your own identity?
Yeah, thanks for asking it that way because I think like it could be easy to assume, oh, don't you already know who you are? Like, don't you already know you're half, right? Um, and that's been something more recent in my life too. Is it's not that I didn't know it because when you go through a grad program like marriage and family therapy, they force you to look at those things, right? Like that's the whole point.
They
So
won't give you your degree unless you do
yeah,
it.
exactly. You got to know who you are, and I take that very seriously. And but even at that time, I didn't truly know what that meant for me. So it wasn't until during COVID where I actually really started understanding what this meant for my identity. And a lot of that was because there were, all of the politics that was going on at that time. And then if you fast forward, then the year anniversary of the pulling out and all that stuff, that even more so helped me understand really what this meant to me. So when I was younger, I grew up a lot with my dad's family. So every Saturday I would go to Woodland Hills and my grandma and grandpa and my koka, he would like we were all together and they'd watch me and we'd had, you know, tons of family parties. I was very immersed with them. And then once we eventually moved to Orange County, things started to change. And then even more so when my grandparents passed away. So that was really like the tipping point is when they passed away because that really they were the glue to our family, our family gatherings, conversation, expectations, things like that. Like they really kept things going. Um, and so it really wasn't until I had this space to process like, you know, who am I as like a professional, but also like outside of that, even more importantly, who am I as a person? Like, let's just start there. And that's when I started, like, when I started meeting more Afghan women, I was like, oh my goodness, like, this all is clicking. Like, this mixed identity is really the foundation of so many of the other parts of my life that I've, like, thought I needed to heal first, but really, like, this one being like the biggest one, the kind of core to everything else.
Hmm.
So
Like
I don't know if that answers.
yeah,
Oh,
no,
go
it
ahead.
did. It did. I mean, it raises so many questions. But so I think to clarify, you were talking about when you discovered the aspect of you as a woman and as an Afghan woman, that kind of was the initial um, sort of click to other aspects of identity. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, like the element of all of what was going on in the world, right?
Mm.
Like my Instagram became flooded with other Afghans, and I had no exposure to that growing up. Like I had my family, but I wasn't around because of how I look, right?
Yeah.
I wasn't that, and then also having a mother who's not of the culture, right? So I'm having two experiences that are very different. And I didn't live super close to, I mean, they live in LA, and then we moved to Orange County. So there was a added layer of like distance a little bit, but we were also such different families, right? Or are.
Hmm.
Um, and so there was just a lot that kind of played into my exposure and then like my dad's internalized, experience of everything that like shaped. the access to these things, like having access to more Afghans versus like, um, my cousin, she has darker skin than I do, right? So we had just such different experiences. So I didn't even get to have Afghan friends. Like I think growing up outside of my family, I only knew like one or two people growing up, and I was like within the span of like in high school I knew one person, and then in my grad school, or no, in undergrad I met two more people, and then in my grad program I knew two people that were Afghan,
Mm.
and never once did I meet half Afghan until actually last year, or maybe it was the beginning of this year in Nowruz,
Okay.
somewhere around there. So it was
Yeah.
like, imagine that, right?
There's even a term for you, Afghan. Have you heard of that?
hmm
Yeah.
I
Okay.
have, I have. I try not to use that word
Yeah.
because just because it kind of perpetuates more of how we feel as
Yeah.
mixed folks.
Yeah, but I would say actually it's an incorrect term because you're not half of anything. You're just a full Afghan and a full American. That's just you're not half of anything, so
Thank you. That's so nice to hear someone else say that.
you're a full Gan.
There you go. I'm gonna tell people that.
Yeah, there you go. New terminology coined here on this show. There you go.
Yes. There we go.
I love how you bring up the whole kind of mixed upbringing because no matter where we come from and in terms of identity buildup is kind of where I'm going. Whether we migrate, whether we are children of um, mixed cultures, identity kind of becomes important because nobody really feels complete. If you're not like a monocultural person in the US, identity becomes a major element because I feel so many aspects of the culture caters to mono sort of cultural, I don't know if that's a term,
Mhm.
um, caters to that, where are you, who are you, where are you from, these sort of questions that we even ask people. And it's a very hard question whenever somebody asks you, where are you from? It's like, how far back do you want me to go? How deep do
Yeah.
you want me to go? And so I wonder, and I want to kind of base it off of your own experience, how others who have multiple identities and cultures and mixed realities, how do you kind of how have you threaded that path and that journey of accepting yourself and understanding yourself more fully, and how can others do the same thing? Like what does it take, um, to kind of take on this journey of acceptance when it comes specifically to multiple identities?
Ooh. Um, what does it take? Wow. Yeah. If I'm being honest, I think one of the biggest things that it takes is bravery. Because I mean, as you know, being Afghan is like, and I don't know, maybe this is horrible to say, but I feel like from my experience, it's been synonymous with grief, because of how much we've been through. So in order for me to step into my identity with so much going on, I have to be willing to accept that I'm going to feel pain, and I will move in and out of that pain throughout my life depending on where I'm at. And that's been the hardest part because when I first started my um, journey of like really honoring my Afghan identity again, having now, less family members alive, um, I had to accept that like I was gonna have to feel this heaviness of this grief that I like avoided at all cost.
Hmm.
But to be honest with you, like it ended up being one of the biggest forms of like relief and like feeling cathartic because I finally felt like I gave myself permission to accept myself, right? And I think I just want to say a big person who really helped facilitate this for me was Sarah, at Prospect Therapy. She does her women. I know you've met her and everything, but she's been a big, catalyst for some of that. And I know, I adore her. She knows that too. But that experience of doing the women's retreat and really recognizing like I'm doing this for myself, but also like in the grand scheme of it, I'm doing it for my lineage and my whole family. So I mean, that's a lot more than you asked for, but I think it's like important to acknowledge that piece to it because it is a journey and it's going to be hard to be able to step into those feelings that come up.
I'm gonna have to mute myself from time to time because my neighbor has started playing drums, and she's a great drummer. I don't know if you can hear her. Do you hear it?
Mm,
No? Okay, good.
no.
In case you hear it in the background, that's what it is. There's no drum track on this interview. There's just my neighbor, and in the afternoon, sometimes I never know when she feels for going for it, but she does. She does, and that's beautiful.
That's
Um,
funny.
and so I love and how beautiful you kind of put that in. Yeah, with Sarajan, I was going to actually mention one of her recent quotes that was on her page. She said, when you were mentioning about grief and how Afghan identity is connected to grief, she put something up there which I'm sure is not related to the grief aspect, but in general, she said that when we come to learn about our culture, we get to decide. We can't save everything, but we can choose what we would like to save, and I thought that was a beautiful quote she had put up. Um, and not sure if it was hers or she stole it because
No,
no,
it probably was her. She's definitely a trendsetter, but I know which one you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah, you seen that one? Yeah, I just
Hmm.
threw it out there so she can come back and say, okay, Misagi, you got to delete my interview with you and no longer your friend. Um,
It's
and
funny.
so I want to kind of dig into whether your reasoning for becoming a marriage and family therapist, the inspiration behind it, perhaps connected with what we're talking about, or perhaps maybe not. But what was the reasoning behind it? Inspiration.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. And it's funny because again, I didn't always have the tools to like communicate these things, not even to myself. So, um, I always knew that when I was growing up, that was when I experienced death like at a very early age because a lot of my family members passed from cancer on my dad's side. So, you know, I was pretty familiar with like the concept of life and death at a very young age. And because of that, it caused a lot of like just strongly impacted my family system directly. And um, I often felt like I just often felt alone, quite honestly. And it was hard to be able to communicate these things to friends or peers because I, one, didn't have, you know, mixed friends for one. And I also like didn't even have the tools and language to communicate it because there was just so much going on. And then you hear like the narrative of like what's, you know, what's in the family stays in the family. So I didn't even think like, oh, maybe you should talk about these things. So I just held it all in. And I remember throughout my childhood that, you know, there were these moments that were so heavy for me that when I was sitting in my room, I would think, I never want anyone to have to be alone the way that I feel right now with like these different things going on. So then fast forward, I end up, you know, kind of going against the grain. And, you know, my dad was like, okay, you have to get your doctorate degree, blah, 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 like do all this, you know, stereotypical stuff that you're supposed to do. And I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to do that, then I'm going to do something that I love. So I decided that I would do marriage and family therapy. And then, yeah, like I realize now, having explored and really taking the time to learn about myself, that a lot of my mixed identity is really directly related to like why I became a therapist. And that piece of not wanting others to feel as alone and know that they have someone, maybe didn't go through exactly what they did, but something very similar that understands. So,
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful, and rightly so. I thought it was deeply connected with your own experiences because nobody just wakes up and says, "Oh, I'm going to be a therapist." No connection to my upbringing or my mission in life. Um,
mhm.
you did bring up such a big thing, concept of grief, that I have to go back on it. That Afghan culture, actually, as you're becoming familiar with it yourself even more, there is so much joy in it. There is so much joy in terms of cultural traditions. There is constantly these cultural traditions where people are getting together to read poetry or to have music. As you know, like the in many Afghan families, you will find, or at least in Afghanistan, maybe not here as much, a tabla and a harmonium, which is like a
Mhm.
small accordion and drums. and all homes, whether they know how to play music or not, it's there. And people are singing all the time, they're dancing all the time. There is so much in Afghan culture, which when you put it then under like attack, under war, you know, of course you're not going to see any of that, or people. But I would even go as far to that the Afghan community over these 40 years of war or more has found ways in the arts to cope. You
Mm.
know, if you've seen, one of the most famous art pieces are these carpets. Of course, carpet weaving is major, rug weaving is major in that region. And most of the rugs from the world do come from Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan region. But a lot of the Afghans began kind of weaving their stories of war into the rugs. I don't know if you've seen the war rugs. It's like a very famous Afghan art form. So you could see like
Mm.
bombs falling, and it's a very interesting piece. So they've used the arts, an art that they have already been mastered in, to tell their stories of what they're seeing in that time and place. So
Mm.
unfortunately, in the current times, or with everything going on, the Afghan identity is so interconnected to grief, and I would have to agree with you on that. But at the same time, I feel like there is opportunities for joy, and
Yes.
there are, um, the elements, the cultural foundations are there.
Yeah, and appreciative that you said that because I was like, oh man, I hope I don't come off as like super negative or anything like that.
No.
Because I grew up in that. Like that's like what I knew my culture to be was a big circle with everyone going in and out and dancing, right? Like and me dancing with them and singing and food and just huge, like big family parties. And that was like those things are like what I hold on to in my childhood. Those are like actually the bits of joy and memories that I'm like so fond of that I don't even talk about it too much because it's so private and precious to me that I like don't want to share with anyone, right? It's like it's mine, you know? Um, but yeah, at the same time, it's funny you mentioned the rugs because my family actually we have some really nice Afghan rugs in our house, and I actually asked they were gonna roll one up and kind of put it to the side for some time, and I was like, "Can I have that in my room?" Because I love it. So I had it in my room for a little bit, and yeah, I loved it, but I didn't know that. So thank you for sharing that with me.
Yeah, of course. As we kind of, I feel like we can have such deep conversations for hours, but as we kind of wrap up this session here, I kind of want to hear and know, um, now with this newfound identity, or emergence of identity, what are your hopes and goals as you kind of move forward in terms of how you like to discover yourself more, and how would you plan to interconnect with the community, or communities that are around you, or what's been coming up or popping up in your sort of atmosphere that you're excited to
Mm.
connect with.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like the first thing that popped in my mind when you said that is connection. Because I know in our culture, like, it's hard to, I don't know, there's like these different ways that we've learned to connect based off of like our own experiences. And so one of the things that I've noticed personally for me is like, how are we connecting with each other in our community? And that's something actually in the group that I'm facilitating that I want to move towards is like this intention of how we show up, right? And because in the how it recognizes like the I and then the we together. And so my hope is that, I can kind of give people who are mixed a voice to really own who they are and know that it's both and it's not this like either or. It doesn't have to be. And the biggest piece to that is that you get to choose that for yourself. So that's kind of like where I've been at and I've been sitting with that for like some time now. And then I decided I worked up enough courage to make the group because that had been something I had thought about for a long time.
Yeah, and this mixed identity is not just applicable to Afghans, but so many other cultures, right, that could benefit from what you learn and
Hmm.
how you operate. Wow, that's beautiful. Well, I thank you so much for being on this show and having this conversation with me. Um,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
this is
you.
such a pleasant conversation. I feel like each of these topics we can take and then do little mini conversations.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate this.
Yeah, of course. And I hope the audiences out there have enjoyed this conversation, which I know they have. And there's more. If you love this, there's more Afghans and amazing stories for you to listen to. So please check those out. And then we'll put some links to Chelze John's organization and work so you can follow her and see what she's been up to and connect with her. So once again, I thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a wonderful day.
You too.